I'd like to apologize for the slightly heavier clapping from the Chinese community. Hello, everyone. I will be talking really briefly and generally about the situation in China from an educational perspective, and just to remind you, I'm really not an expert on describing what is the situation in China in terms of education, but I work in education setting, and I'd like to just share some of what I think that might connect with what the conference is for the rest of for the next few days, and so in that respect, I really want to take us back as far as I could, and to look at the historical view of the Chinese education. And then I like to pose some questions in the end, just to lead us into the workshop in the afternoon, which, as far as I know, could be really interesting to connect what Jolt has said in terms of imagination. So, but before that, I'd like to just simply share an incident that happened 10 years ago. So I'd like to just share this photo. Can everyone see that? This is not actually from the incident because there's no record or no photos or no camera that record what happened back in 2006. But this is a very recent incident in January this year. And an old lady just fell in the middle of the street. And as you can see, that there are people around her, and I don't really know what's happened after this, but as we can see from the photo, the people are simply just watching her. And this reminds us of a very infamous incident that happened in 2006, which is a quite controversial case, which is called the Peng Yu case. Peng Yu is a young person from Nanjing, which is part of a Jiangsu province. And one day she just run into an old lady on the street. And according to him, later in the court, he said he just saw an old lady, and he didn't even see her fall. He just see her lying on the street. So he went to help her, and he went to help her to go to the hospital and actually pay for her, because the relatives that comes about an hour and 2 hours later didn't have enough cash. Then he was sued by the old lady for pushing her down. It's a very interesting incident, and then of course the first sentence, and he says in the verdict that he has 40% of responsibility, and he has to compensate the family. But this is the whole what goes on in the case. But what interests me is what really happened. What happened? And this was really interesting to echo my fellow speakers in terms of, we do live in the objective reality. We do live in this is world. I can touch it and it exists. But we also live in a different form of reality, which is here. And how do we understand? How do we give a concept of knocking on the table? In a different culture, it means different things. I just learned this recently when I said some really bad things, and people we don't want them to happen. This is not existing in the reality, but it is in a way, because we all understand that. So there's a really interesting thing of us both living in both contexts, and then we share one with another, animals with the planet. But as I said during the break to Joel, a monkey doesn't really give any means about what a table means. A monkey doesn't know there's a table. A monkey doesn't need a table because he doesn't really live in that part of reality. So I think it would be really interesting to mention the case. I will come back to this later in my speech. But I just like to show you what people say after the case. The old lady say, I saw him push me. I see him. The family of the old lady say, we want justice. And another family member of the old lady said, if he didn't push her, why send her to hospital and pay for her? And the last one is from a commentary of the website, which is dedicated for the series. That's where the first photo comes from. Is really for senior citizens, is to really remind them, try not to fall, okay? Because it's dangerous. And let's read the verdict. I'd just like to give, I'll read out. The more practical way for the defendant, if he wanted to do a good deed, is to help with identifying who pushed her, not helping her himself, because that'll get you in trouble. What's interesting about the incident is that after it happened in 2006, but there were at least 77 references on Wikipedia that recorded a similar case in China. And there are 59 of the exactly same, but no one helped the old lady. So it created a really nationwide debate on, are we going to help, particularly being a younger generation, are we going to help them when we see someone just lying on the street? Or are we just decided that didn't happen and leave? Both the old lady and Peng Yu, as a young man living in Beijing, both of them are educated in China, obviously. And I like to really argue that even though they have some 50 years of gap in their age group, I'd really like to argue that their education hasn't changed much. So I'll come back to the incident, and there will be some really interesting debate, I think, that can go around the imagination and reality, and also what really goes on in our society. So I'd just like to briefly talk about the education that both the old lady and Peng Yu have attended, have experienced. So this is the education system of China, and we have a 9-year compulsory education system, which is from 6 years old to 14, really, to 15. And you have to enter kindergarten before, but it's not compulsory. And the high school, what we call the high school, the second level of the secondary, isn't compulsory either, and then the higher education. What's more important about knowing the Chinese education is really about knowing what happened when you turn 18, when you attend the national exams. So for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of Gaokao, it's one of the most severe and critical exams that any child, any student who's studying in China, when they turn 18, they go attend the National Higher Education Entrance Examination, which defines for almost 40 years Chinese people's fate. And particularly in the rural community, when you want to go into cities and work and stay, attending Gaokao is one of the most important things for you as a young person. And the interesting thing about Gaokao is that people tend to think that it's a one-off thing. It is, because it's an annual thing, and when you turn 18, you go to attend. But actually, if you look at Chinese education, Gaokao is everywhere. Because when you attend the primary school, since you're 6, 7 years old, you start to prepare for Gaokao. So our education is really based on the final test, the big test in your life. So a 6 years old to an 18, more than 1 decade of time, a Chinese student in the city, in the rural places, take thousands, hundreds and thousands of tests to prepare you to compete with your peers. And this is a very regular, traditional, normal Chinese classroom. And apart from that, there are more than 40 people in one classroom. I just like to remind you, you couldn't read or see what's said on the blackboard. It says, keep your head down. Follow the teacher. Value every day. This is taken, I think, during a test, during a small exams. And every 3 years, beginning when you're 13, going to the secondary, every 3 years you take a test for the test, which also defines which schools you go to. It defines which major you learn about. And in China, if you want to work in education, the higher the grades are, you work in the higher education, which is the most ridiculous thing in the world. So any kindergarten teacher you met in China, they did really wrong, did really bad in their Gaokao test, because they're just put in a group because their grades aren't that high. So you teach kids because they don't know anything. So this is how a young person, this is how a young student is defined in their life, based on 3 days, and it tests mathematics, science, and literature as the 3 compulsory one, and you can decide if you add an X, which often you can select from history, geography, and other subjects. But what's more important is this 3 subjects, which is also tested in PISA test. And interestingly, that it is this system that sent China, well, Shanghai really, because China didn't really attend in 2012, but Shanghai did both in 2009 and 2012, on the top of PISA test on mathematics, science, and literature. So some people will argue that this is the most successful model in education, because we do test well, and these kids are really performing well. But that isn't really the case. I'm just showing you some photos of the smaller tests in different areas in China. And again, we're not that thrilled by the by the lines of people, because we're just quite used to it. But this looks like not the final test. It's a small test. It's probably a provincial test. That's why there's so many people sitting in the same room. One thing that is quite noticeable about the PISA test is the Chinese students test really high in reading and literature, which if you ask any of the Chinese delegations or any Chinese that you've met, the Chinese students really don't have a habit of reading literature. But why they test so high? The interesting fact is that there are 2/3 of publications are textbooks in China. So these kids are reading. They do read, but they read all the questions and all the tests, all the exams, and they read a notion amount of how to get the right answer. And how do you do that? You do that by memorizing. It's just simple as that. And every one of Chinese members sitting in the audience today got through this by rote learning, by simply memorizing an equation or anything that can just take you to the right answer. So it's really not about you getting the knowledge. It's really about you, since you're 6 years old, getting through the test, getting through the better school, and hopefully, if you're interested in education, you can go teach middle school or high school other than kindergarten kids. So it's really worth noticing that because people are so proud of our PISA test now, and I know that from my very limited resource, knowing that people in the government in Hungary and also some parts of the education ministry in the UK is really trying to grasp how come Chinese students test so well in PISA test. So I'm going to come back to this point later as well. So this is a very typical ritual that kids do. In the end of, when they finish Gaokao, when they finish the 3-day examination, they tend to just, and isn't that interesting that they didn't really go out to drink, that they didn't really organize something in the public space. They stay in their classroom, and I'm sure every one of the Chinese delegations here experienced something like this. Maybe not personally, but they've seen someone that these, by the way, are the, how do you call that? The sheet for questions, the sheet for the exams that you take out, yes, examination papers. This is the ritual, and I like to ask you to think about why. But this is not a new invention. The Gaokao system was established right after the New China, which is back to 1949. And it was shortly suspended during Cultural Revolution and very quickly resumed after Cultural Revolution ended. Well, after Mao died, really, which is 1979. But this is really a new version of a very old tradition in ancient China, which is Keju. The imperial examination, which was first implemented in around mid-Tang dynasty, which is about the year of 600s, and it was abolished in 1905 when we went through our revolution. So for almost more than 1 century, a Keju system or imperial exams is the only way to select state bureaucracy. So intellectuals or officers, if you want to go work for government, which in the back days is probably the only channel that you can go through if you want to really, really realize what you can do for the country. And the interesting fact about the Keju system is that it also has different levels of tests, starting from a child exams when they turn teenagers, to the county exams, the municipal exams, the provincial exams, and finally the court or the palace exams, which is usually supervised by the emperor himself. What's interesting about Keju is that it doesn't test new things. What it tests is what we called 四书五经, which is the 4 textbooks and 5 texts. So 9 books, basically. And it tests what you think and how do you interpret these classic Confucian thinking texts. And one of the important things about Keju is that it writes in a very rigid and artificial structure, which is called bagu. It actually creates a structure of an essay, so you don't have to think about how do you write these things, how do you interpret yourself, how you understand the classics. It is provided as a very rigid structure. So how you open an argument and how you support an argument. There are 8 different sections in the bagu system. So every student, when they attend Keju exams, you have to follow the exact structure, leaving whoever wants to get more creative the rhetoric. So what's interesting about that, it doesn't really test how well responsible you are if you want to serve the country. It certainly doesn't test that. It certainly doesn't test your personal and your social responsibilities. But it really tests your writing skills. So what it really keeps all the intellectuals, all the people who actually think about serving the country in a very narrowed way, is make them stay in a rhetorical context. And that's the only space, little space, where you can get more creative. And I'd like to share one thing about that. In the modern version of Keju, which is Gaokao, is that you can go into almost any bookstores in China and get books of how to write your diaries, how to pass the writing text, and there is still, I would argue, a very fixed structure, even though it's not compulsory in the writing of Gaokao. So it's the same. One other thing that is still the same. This is a portrait of the court of the palace exams, which is supervised by, this is from Song Dynasty, the emperor himself. And normally this is taken every 3 years. You have to think about, for a country that has a biggest population, one needs to wait for every 3 years, after studying for many years already, to take one of these. And these are the really, really delicately selected people. So there's only a few of them are able to hit the top. Quite like the PISA test, really. And whoever is at the first 3 will serve for the emperor. But how do you serve him without understanding the current situation? Without understanding, because these 9 books are written already, even in the year of 600, already decades, hundreds ago. How do you serve him? By memorizing these lines, understanding these lines. You can't. So it was not you serving or understanding what the society goes on outside. It's really about you keeping everything within the classroom. And what's interesting about that is that there are 2 famous lines from the ancient, it's falling in the gap, from the ancient Chinese poetry, which I'd like to, thank you. I really think that it's not translated well in English, so I don't know how do we, let's just try. It says, the first one, for decades study in cold window, noticed by none, fame fills the land, one's honors are won. Let's see how that translates to Hungarian. I'll explain. For decades study in cold window, noticed by none. No one noticed that you've been studying for decades because you're in your own room, you're in your own prison. Fame fills the land, one's honors are won. When you win the title, and it is called the title actually, everybody knows you. So it's interesting how it leaves a huge gap between. And another line, which I'll explain later. Ears do not hear out of the window. One reads only the books of sages. You don't hear what's outside, the window. You don't need to know what goes on outside there because it's all in the books. And I really like everyone to think about why. Why these 2 lines, every one of, again, Chinese delegations, they know these lines is rooted in our way of thinking, way of forming an understanding about what education is when we're really little. And I don't have to repeat also how some people take different medicines in China for girls and for a long time to change their, what's the word, menstrual periods, just because that they have to perform well. And talking about imagining a different reality, talking about giving a different meaning to what's there. And this is human. This is not a table. So I believe these 2 lines really capture the essence of the education in China. And it's still one of the most important things that happen in the city. Policemen close roads on those 3 days to escort these students. When is the last time that they do that? This is where, again, it's from Song Dynasty. This is where they test. It's, again, very coincidentally, 3 days. And you're only allowed to take very limited things, brush, ink, and some of them don't even eat when they do this. And they're recorded incident of people die. And when you die, they just put in the straw and then just put you somewhere else. And what's interesting about this system, both Keju and Gaokao, is that it almost emphasizes the importance of cheating. Because it's all about getting the right answer. It's all about getting past the test. It's a very pragmatic move. So if you want to pass the test, you have to get strategic. You have to get tactical. And I also would like to venture that, including myself, that we've all done it. What's interesting about Keju is that they put, I couldn't find the photos, but it's really interesting to see the photos of these young students putting the text on their underwear, and then they take it in. But that I argue, it is still happening in almost every schools in China. I mean, of course, there are students who can do well in test. There's just absolutely evident of that. But I'd like you to think about what does this system encourage the society? What happened when these students who are so used to getting the right answer, to go into society when they graduate, to go to different workplace, what happened when they have their own children? But this is not over. What I would like to think the Chinese system is really to see it in a political way, is really to see it as not just an education system that might or might not do good for our children. What's interesting about this whole system, starting from the mid-year 600 to today, is that it's almost a form of social control, rather than discussing what's good and what's best and what's not bad, what's not good for our students. So there's a researcher named Zhao Yong, and he nicely put what he thinks that connects with the Keju's institution and what goes on in our country today here. So I just liked, if you can all read? No? For 1300 years, Chinese emperors were delivered a homogeneous and obedient citizenry in three ways. First, through the exams, they recruited individuals who demonstrated the greatest commitment to Confucian thinking to help defend the status quo and perpetuate the regime. These fortunate scholar officials, which is what people become, that's their title when they serve the country, these scholar officials became not only devout defenders, but also capable promoters of imperial rule. Skilled writers and speakers of Confucian thinking, they were living examples of the benefits of studying for the exam. Second, even those who failed at exams became defenders and promoters, because often they were hired as teachers to help prepare future generations for the exams. Third, after decades of studying the Confucian test, even if a man did not become a believer, he would have little time, energy, and resources left to develop the skills, knowledge, and independent ideas needed for a rebellion. And you wonder, well, how come we have a one-party system for already 65 years? So this is, I think, is really nicely put in terms of how do we understand from a political perspective of the education system in China. But I said it's not over because there's a social impact. Starting from 1978, the Chinese government implemented the only child policy, which is known as the creator of the little emperors. The only child policy is suspended this year. It becomes the second child policy this year. So what happened from 1978 to 2015 is the Chinese government creates an entire generation of only child. And the impact that it engenders to our lives, our personal lives, our social lives, the families, the social construction, have not really been measured because it just ended. Thinking about the first Cologne person, after 30 years. Maybe it's a nice time to think about, but after 3 years, it's really difficult to measure. And it's really difficult to know if it's working. And it's really difficult to know and admit that there are some really negative impact. But I like I like to talk a little bit about, because I'm an only child and I belong to this generation. And when it comes to knowing that there's no real sense of a generation with the young people today, Chinese young people from China, they really have a sense of generation, because they're called almost on every media, when people talk about this generation, they're called the only child. And he created this little emperor syndrome, where if you think about that, traditionally in Chinese history, which is also interesting connecting with the structure, that is the shift in social structure, is really around the father in the family. So we've all heard from the literature, from the books that we read, from the movie that we've seen, this Chinese father. It's really, everything is go around him. He provides food, he provides house, he provides everything, education for their children. But the only child policy completely challenged that, because the attention goes in the other way. Thinking about it, there are at least six parents looking at one child. And this is not only for one family, this is the entire generation. It also changed the city structures, because this is only implemented in urban area. That we don't really need a bigger apartment anymore. We don't really need a yard anymore, which is, when old people in Beijing or Shanghai, they live in a bigger place, because you have a bigger family. So it completely changed our society. And again, the impact hasn't really been measured. We really don't know what's right and what's wrong about this thing, because it's so present. It's so out of the window. But if we keep our head down, if we follow our teachers, if we value every day, in the sense that you value every day to take your time to take the test, to prepare the text, you really cannot hear what goes on. You cannot really connect you as an only child in this generation and what goes on out of the window when a woman falls on the street. But again, this is not over. Oh, by the way, this is mine. This is my registration as an only child. And I really like to argue that for the first 30 years, the modern China was influenced by a red book, and we all know what that is. But I really would like people to think about, for the next 30 years, starting from 78, what this little red book tells us about our society. And I really argue strongly that this is really making a big change in China, in modern China, that hasn't really been talked about and hasn't really been discussed about and hasn't really been allowed to have any literature that says a negative impact. Apart from that, we really successfully control the population, which is true. Hence, we save the planet. But is that enough? I just would like to go on what I think that is not enough, is that when you measure or assess the political concern from the education system, when you assess the social impact from the only child policy mainly, there are of course other social impact created within 30 years. There are also another cultural impact that needs to be assessed when it comes to education, which is the consumerism that we're living through. And I don't really need to say much about that, because we're really living in an age that everything has a price. Everything literally has a price. That's why we can ship those people from across the sea to this country, to different country. They all have a price. And what I think that is the real crisis within the consumerism culture is the convenience that it creates. It really creates a convenient aspect of us owning ourselves and us owning the objective reality. So the ownership is not really, when you have, let's say, when you have a Mac computer and when you have a PC, you're also branded, you're also defined as a Mac person. I'm a Mac person, I'm an iPhone person, and he's a Samsung person. And we're so used to the narrative of that. And so the ownership, when we own an iPhone phone, we're also communicated through the value of the things rather than the value of me using it. And we're wondering, how come I never really put, Andre asked us to put our phones there. It really creates an anxiety in the room, even though we know Andre wouldn't do anything about them. So this, as it almost becomes a cultural ideology, that everything that has a price, that everything is so convenient to get, leaves also another gap, which is really, if you think about it, inconvenient, is what we can do in this thing. And I'd really like to argue that in terms of the political concern, in terms of the social impact created from the only child policy, and in terms of the cultural consumerism that we're living in now, we really have to measure and see it in the education. And I really don't see it in the Chinese education, that these three aspects are well assessed or even mentioned. And I really haven't met any single teacher in Chinese, kindergarten or otherwise, who can talk about this. And I really like to argue that's because that we've been trained, we've been put in the window. We're all in the window. Even though we can talk to our friends in Hungary just by simply pushing a button, but we're all in the window. And the system hasn't really changed in a century, more than a century. But here's the positive note. I've given this back in 2015. And what happened is that last year, our government issued several suggestions for the reinforcement and reform of arts education in schools, which is the first policy that introduced drama in curriculum. Is this a good news? Or, following what I think about the education system that hasn't really changed, and it really has worked for political reasons, for political purpose, is this the new 科举? Is this the new 科举 in the convenience of some people making drama that I think is a rather complex art in a very condensed, very simplified, very conventional way? Is it really open the gap for our young people to think about what they can do for the world and themselves? This is what I like to ask, because I don't know. This is such a new policy. This is such a new thing. It's the same with the second child policy. Is everything fine now that we can have the second one? Really? So I like to pose that as a question. And we really have to be careful if there is the political reality that has changed already, that we haven't measured. Isn't there a social impact, a new social impact that created from either the second child policy or other policies? And isn't the cultural ideology that we're living in worth considered when we have 40 kids, 30 kids, 20 kids, 3 years old, 15 in front of us? And I think there is a huge gap in there. And lastly, going back on the streets, if we were to dramatize that little incident that happened on the street, if we were to put it in a different form of imaginary, different form of reality, is there a space for us to open a gap where the social, the political, the ideological, and the cultural can be active? We can see that, can be explicit. Is there any way that we can penetrate what we really feel powerless about in reality, in drama? So when we go back to reality, we know what it is because we really see. Is there an opportunity to do that? Is there a method to do that? Is there a frame, a structure to do that? This is what I think that the GAP conference is. So I really like to pose that as a question for you lot, for this afternoon, for the workshops, and for the other keynote tomorrow, to really think about, can we do that? Are we able to do that? Is it possible to do that? So we can truly live in the gap. Thank you.